You couldn't see the river from the window anymore. You could, until Mamachi had the back veranda closed in with Imanam's first sliding folding door. The oil portraits of Reverend John Epe and Aliuthi Amachi, Esther and Rahel's great-grandparents, were taken down from the back veranda and put up in the front one. They hung there now, the little blessed one and his wife, on either side of the stuffed, mounted bison head. Reverend Epe smiled his confident ancestor smile out across the road instead of the river. Aliuthi Amachi looked more hesitant, as though she would have liked to turn around but couldn't. Perhaps it wasn't as easy for her to abandon the river. With her eyes, she looked in the direction that her husband looked. With her heart, she looked away. Her heavy, dull gold kunuku earrings had stretched her earlobes and hung all the way down to her shoulders. Through the holes in her ears, you could see the hot river and the dark trees that bent into it, and the fishermen in their boats and the fish. Though you couldn't see the river from the house anymore, like a seashell always has a sea sense, the Imenham house still had a river sense. A rushing, rolling, fish-swimming sense. From the dining room window, where she stood, with the wind in her hair, Rahel could see the rain drum down on the rusted tin roof of what used to be their grandmother's pickle factory. Paradise Pickles Amp Preserves. It lay between the house and the river. They used to make pickles, squashes, jams, curry powders, and canned pineapples. And banana jam. After the FPO, Food Products Organization, banned it, because according to their specifications, it was neither jam nor jelly. Too thin for jelly, and too thick for jam. An ambiguous, unclassifiable consistency, they said, as per their books. Looking back now, to Rahel, it seemed as though this difficulty that their family had with classification ran much deeper than the jam-jelly question. Perhaps Amu, Esther and she were the worst transgressors. But it wasn't just them. It was the others too. They all broke the rules. They all crossed into forbidden territory. They all tampered with the laws that lay down who should be loved and how much. The laws that make grandmothers grandmothers, uncles uncles, mothers mothers, cousins cousins, jam jam, and jelly jelly. It was a time when uncles became fathers, mothers lovers, and cousins died and had funerals. It was a time when the unthinkable became thinkable, and the impossible really happened. Even before Sophie Moll's funeral, the police found Voluta. His arms had goosebumps, where the handcuffs touched his skin. Cold handcuffs, with a sour metal smell. Like steel bus rails, and the smell of the bus conductor's hands, from holding them. After it was all over, baby Kachama said, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. As though she had nothing to do with the sowing and the reaping. She returned on her small feet to her cross-stitch embroidery. Her little toes never touched the floor. It was her idea that Esther be returned. Margaret Kachama's grief and bitterness at her daughter's death coiled inside her like an angry spring. She said nothing, but slapped Esther whenever she could in the days she was there before she returned to England. Rahel watched Amu pack Esther's little trunk. Maybe they are right, Amu's whisper said. Maybe a boy does need a barber. Rahel saw that. Her eyes were redly dead. They consulted a twin expert in Hyderabad. She wrote back to say that it was not advisable to separate monozygotic twins, but that two-egg twins were no different from ordinary siblings, and that, while they would certainly suffer the natural distress that children from broken homes underwent, it would be nothing more than that. Nothing out of the ordinary. And so, Esther was returned in a train, with his tin trunk, and his beige and pointy shoes rolled into his khaki holdall. First class, overnight, on the Madras mail to Madras, and then with a friend of their father's, from Madras to Calcutta. He had a tiffin carrier, with tomato sandwiches. And an eagle flask, with an eagle. He had terrible pictures in his head. Rain rushing, inky water, and a smell, sick sweet. like old roses on a breeze. But worst of all, he carried inside him the memory of a young man with an old man's mouth. The memory of a swollen face and a smashed, upside-down smile. Of a spreading pool of clear liquid with a bare bulb reflected in it. Of a bloodshot eye that had opened, wandered, and then fixed its gaze on him. Esther. And what had Esther done? He had looked into that beloved face and said, yes, yes, it was him. The word, Esther's octopus couldn't get at. Yes, hoovering didn't seem to help. It was lodged there, deep inside some fold or furrow, like a mango hair between molars. That couldn't be worried loose. In a purely practical sense, it would probably be correct to say that it all began when Sophie Moore came to Imenham. Perhaps it's true that things can change in a day. That a few dozen hours can affect the outcome of whole lifetimes, and that when they do, those few dozen hours, like the salvaged remains of a burned house, the charred clock, the singed photograph, the scorched furniture, must be resurrected from the ruins and examined. Preserved, accounted for. Little events, ordinary things, smashed and reconstituted. Imbued with new meaning. Suddenly, they become the bleached bones of a story. Still to say that it all began when Sophie Moore came to Imenham is only one way of looking at it. Equally, it could be argued that it actually began thousands of years ago. Long before the Marxists came. Before the British took Malabar. Before the Dutch ascendancy. Before Vasco da Gama arrived. Before the Zamorin's conquest of Calicut. Before 3 purple-robed Syrian bishops, murdered by the Portuguese, were found floating in the sea, with coiled sea serpents, riding on their chests, and oysters knotted in their tangled beards. It could be argued that it began long before Christianity arrived in a boat, and seeped into Kerala, like tea from a tea bag. That it really began in the days when the love laws were made. The laws that lay down who should be loved and how much. However, for practical purposes in a hopelessly practical world,